Good afternoon, guys. Today I've got something quite exciting for you. It's something I've been working on for quite a while, and it's creating animated water using nothing but Poser's procedural nodes. So what you should hopefully be seeing on the screen at the moment is an animation that I created. It's just a few seconds on loop. And what we're going to do is work out how to create that today. So first of all, I'm just going to open a file that I created earlier and just show you a quick render of one that I made earlier. So I'm just opening the file now. Hopefully my mouse pointer thing is working. So we've got a Viking Drakkar ship against a single plane, and if I render that a single frame, this is only rendering HD, so that's 1920 by 1080. You will quickly see the water effect that I'm referring to statically. And there are a lot of parameters that you can change on this, which is why I love it so much. Originally, I tried to create a water effect using Poser's wave modifier, but the trouble is that the size of the waves has a minimum size. So there you can see we've got two light sources, one creating the white reflections on the crest of the waves, and then one creating the sunlight look. But with the wave modifier, obviously one of the things that you want when creating water, especially if you're creating oceans, is large planes, and the wave modifier's minimum wave size is proportional to the size of the plane you're creating them on. So as the plane gets larger, then the minimum size, which is 1 or 0.1 or something like that, just isn't small enough to create these fine detailed waves. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to create this today using the fractal modifier. So I'm just going to create a new document now. And what we're going to do is we're going to load a plane. So hopefully you guys have... oh, I've docked that. Let me undock that. Okay, I'll do it this way. Auto docking is really annoying. So hopefully you guys have a primitives folder, and then you've got this ground plane object inside. Otherwise you're going to need a flat plane, and we're going to need to subdivide it. So first of all, we're going to bring this square plane into the scene, and we're going to get rid of the ground plane. We don't care about that construct in the background. So here hopefully is the square ground plane that I've created, which I'm just going to call C, and just make sure that there we go. So it's this plane here. Okay, so one of the first things I'm going to do is get rid of this lighting, because this lighting doesn't suit exterior scenes. So I'm going to go up to scripts, and I'm going to choose utility, and I'm going to do delete lights. That's going to delete everything. Then I'm going to create a new light, and I'm going to change its properties so that it's an infinite light, something like sunlight, and I'm going to pull that to the front so that it's kind of shining down on the scene with a kind of a lowish forward angled position, and that's just going to show off the details better. Now we're going to go into the materials, and I'm going to pick up the material for this C, and I'm just going to add in 3D textures. I'm going to go to here and create this FBM, which is a fractal modifier. I don't know why it's called FBM, but anyway, I'm going to drag that into the displacement. Now, as you well know, displacement with Superfly doesn't work very well. Well, it's based on microfacet displacement. So anything you do needs enough polygons to be able to show. So if I show you this in hidden line view, you can see here each of these square polygons. There's not really an awful lot of detail. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the subdivision up to number 4. So each of those is a multiplier. So 1 is twice as many as 2. 2 is 4 times as many as 0. Sorry, 1 is twice as many as 0. 2 is 4 times as many as 0, and so on. So we're just going to go to 4, which I guess means 16 times as many. Ignore that, the scene's quite simple, and you should immediately see the number of polygons increase. I don't know why it's taken quite so long. There we go. So we've got lots of polygons to work with now, and that's really important. If you're using Firefly, you don't need to do that stage, and your scene will be a lot more nimble to work with. Now, what we can do to do ourselves a favour is just turn the preview down to 0, and then it will only show when we do the render. So let's go back to the materials. So we've got this FBM or fractal modifier, and we just create here. So what we're trying to do is we're going to use this modifier to create waves by displacing or pushing out the texture of this plane. So as you can see, it's quite cloudy, so we've got quite a few different changes to make here. So the first thing we're going to do is just change the scale. So we want the X scale, that's the left to right scale, to be 20. The Y scale is irrelevant. We can leave it at 4 or we can change it. And the Z scale, that's distance. Now, if I set 20, that would again create even X and Y amounts of waves, but I actually find that this is better if you do 4 to 1. So the X scale is 4 times as wide as the Z scale. Sorry, as the Z scale, and that just creates waves that look good going off into the distance. So now let's go through these other settings. So the fractal increment is the roughness, as it were, of the map here. So I'm just going to set that to 2. And that will smooth that out. What we want is nice smooth wave pattern here that's going to convert into displacement, which is nice and smooth. If it's not smooth, what you're going to get is jagged steps and the waves won't look realistic, even though the Superfly displacement is actually smoother than the Firefly displacement. So frequency gap, we're just going to set that to 2. That's we don't really need to mess around with that. Octaves. Now, the octaves, you can think of that as the number of iterations of the fractal formula. So a fractal formula is a mathematical formula that creates this kind of noise pattern. And each iteration, so if I set that to 1, the same as the subdivisions actually, if I set it to 1, then it's just 1 iteration. I set it to 2, 2 iterations. 3 is 4 iterations. 4 is 16 iterations, and so on. And the more octaves you have, the slower it is to render. So I'm just going to turn that down to 4. Now, you can think of octaves as being the amount of subharmonics in the waves. And by that I mean, if you have a wave, the amount of noise on the wave, or the subwaves, if you think of a wave as being a fractal pattern, that is a pattern which, if you look at it small, is a duplication of the larger size, or the smaller elements are just smaller versions of the bigger wave. The more subharmonics you have, the better the waves look up really close. Or if you had, say, a wave that had like a little wave machine or a little vibrating thing where you had very fast, tiny waves, you might increase the octaves here to create these subharmonics. But I find that for ocean waves or pond waves, 4 is going to work just fine. Okay, going down to here. So bottom is the you can think of it as the ratio of black to white, where white is high and black is low. For now, I'm just going to leave that on 0. The bias, that you can think of that as the balance. So if I turn that up, it becomes all white. If I turn it down, almost all black. So it's the ratio or the balance between the number of white pixels and the number of black pixels. So for now, I'm just going to turn that to 0.5. So it's a range from 0 to 1. Then the gain. Okay, the gain is very useful. I'm going to leave that at 0.5, but you could think of the gain as contrast. So the blacks become black, the range between the whites and the blacks. At the moment, this is kind of greys and not fully black, not fully white, but and that creates nice smooth waves. But the sharper the contrast, the more the blacks are, the nearer to true black and the nearer to true white, the greater the magnification of the wave. So if you want really big rough waves, you might change that gain to 1 where it's almost black and white. But that does tend to create sharp waves, and then you need to soften them down in other areas. So for now, we're just going to leave that at 0.5. Noise type, don't need to mess about with that. And offset, now we're not going to play with the offset right now, but the offset is used for animation. I'll show you how to do that in a minute. For now, what we need to do is the displacement. So usually this displacement setting is fine for furniture sized objects and trees and stuff like that, but for this it's a really large object, so I'm going to displace this by 0.3. And now all we need to do is set a bit of colour. So I'm just going to set this to some kind of shade of blue. And I'm going to turn the specular value down to 0.2 because I don't want too much shining going on. And the specular colour to white. I don't know why it sets that to grey all the time by default. That's really quite annoying. So let's just give that a quick test render. We'll just go up here and set the render settings quite low. So we're doing Superfly. Because I'm using my Threadripper, I'm going to use this side of the rendering. If I was using my graphics card here, I'd be turning adaptive sampling off, and I'd be using this side instead. So I'm going to turn that on, and I'm going to turn on branched path. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to leave that on 3 samples, which is a kind of a nice low introductory level. And I'm just going to do a test area. Now, whenever you start using displacement, there's always this setup period at the beginning, which often looks as if it's doing nothing. And indeed, also when you're doing hair simulations, you get this long setup. But then once you've done that once, even if you're doing animations, I don't know if it has to do it again, but if it does, it's certainly a lot quicker. Okay, so here we go. We can see this sample. Actually, what I should do is set the render dimensions to screen so it fits in the preview window. So let me just quickly do that again. So what I'm not going to show you today is a water material. What I'm doing here is showing you the displacement material to create the waves, but the water material can be quite an issue in its own right, the amount of transparency and all of that kind of stuff. Okay, so you can see that's kind of looking okay. I might put a light underneath here just to shine up to give us more contrast, if you like, more brightness. But for today, what I'm just going to do is I'm going to take this angle light here, turn on ray trace shadows, and I'm just going to turn the intensity up to, let's say, 150. Then I'm going to put another light at the back, another infinite light. So infinite lights don't converge on a point, and I'm going to move that to the back so it's shining forwards into the scene, so it's a low sunlight, and I'm just going to change that colour to some kind of golden orange here, so it represents maybe a sunset. Okay, so let's just okay, and I'll call that sun set, and I'll call this one at the front. Let me just recolour this one. Here's a good daylight setting, incidentally. I click on there to, let me just show you that again. I click on this node here to change the colour, and I could manually dial the colours in, but I prefer to go up to here, and a good colour for daylight is 240 in the red, 240 in the green, and 255 in the blue, and that creates a good midday kind of bluish colour. Now I could have gone into here and just gone into the parameters for light 1 and just changed them in here, but I don't, you know, 9.9411, what does that mean? You know, I'm easier thinking in terms of RGBs on a 255 scale. And I'm just going to change that light name to front sun. Okay, now let's just give that a full scene test. And again, that slow setup. This is the bit where it basically does the subdivision in its memory of that plane. So the subdivision, as I said before, gives us more polygons to work with, but it can be time consuming. Okay, so that's looking nice. Now, tweaking the material again here. So I'm just going to pick that material up. I'm just going to add a tiny bit of transparency here, maybe 0.2. So it's on a scale of 0 to 1. 1 is completely transparent, 0 is completely opaque. So I'm going to put 0.2 transparency there. I could maybe make this a little bit more bluey green, a bit more sea green. There we go. Okay, and what I'm going to do, I'm also going to bring in a boat just for some scale. Whenever you're working with something on a large scale like this or with a hair simulation, it's always nice to have an object that just gives you scale. So I've got a vehicles folder over in figures, and I'm just going to bring a boat in. Okay, so what boat did I do? I did Drakkar. There we go. So now I'm just returning here to texture shaded view, and I can see my boat, so maybe moving a little bit closer. Another test render. Now we've got some scale, we can see how those waves look relatively. Incidentally, the subdivision, there you go, that's a bit more of a kind of a deep blue, no, I guess that's quite shallow actually if it's that light. Often what I'll do is I'll put another plane the same size underneath and put a sand material on, so that as I increase the transparency here, look, you can just see the shape of the boat here. So there's the shadow showing here from the main sunlight, but you've also got the shape of the hull coming through here with that transparency. And as soon as you start to add transparency, sometimes it can really bring the texture out, especially if you have a beach here or something like that. If you add another layer underneath it. Now that sun is not really showing up very well, so I'm going to make that a much more pronounced reddish orangey colour. And let me just see. There we go. So that's a much lower in the sky now. Okay. Okay, maybe I do need to turn the specularity up because I'm not getting enough shine off those waves. Usually with specularity, I like to think that less is more. But just for the sake of this, where I really want to show off the structure of the waves, I think, you know, sometimes just turning it up and then you can dial it down with test renders. I'm sure you guys know that whenever you're iterating upon it, there you go, now we can start to see some of this lovely orange colour coming on the backside of the waves. I could really dial that intensity up, but for now that'll make the point. This ship is ancient and it's got this really crappy sail, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make that sail invisible. So I click on the boat. So I know I've got the boat selected, so now I just have to go materials and find the one that looks like it's a sail, and the only materialish one there is cloth. And the easiest way to make it visible is just to turn the transparency up to 1. Make sure you turn the specularity down, or sometimes you'll get an outline left behind, and that'll work well. Just pick this up. I will just dial that specularity up to say 0.5. Now, here's a really important thing. Remember I talked about these offset values. Ignore the Y value, you're not going to need this, but offset X is the horizontal movement. Now either the ship is passing through the ocean or the ocean is just very gently drifting. So we would generally use the X direction to create some sense of movement there, or you could use the Z to have the ocean moving at right angles or perpendicular to the boat. That doesn't tend to look so good, but what I find is with the X, this is an animation value. So at the moment, if I just put any value I want there, 1, 10, 100, whatever, it wouldn't notice on a static render, because all you're doing is just moving this image. Look, let me just show you. So if I put 10 there, same image, just 10 positions, start position 10 further. But this is the really important bit. If I want to animate, what I need to do is turn on this animation key. I don't know why certain parameters are set to locked off by default. I guess it just kind of saves mistakes. But before we do that, let's go down to here. So by default, the animation system at the bottom here is set to 30 frames. That's set for NTSC or American Standard Animation, where it's 29.97 frames per second. So we're on the first frame, which it always defaults to. I wish it by default it would just go to frame 1 of 1, because it's really annoying if you accidentally press enter like that and then you're on a higher frame number and you've done all of your light and stuff on or simulations on a higher frame number. You know, it just really it can be annoying. But anyway, so we've got 30 frames, so that's going to be 1 second. Now if we were going to save that or replay it on a PAL TV, you'd set that to 25 or 23.97. But for now, anytime you're playing on the internet, you just decide how many frames per second it will be. So you could have 15 frames a second or whatever. I'm going to leave this to 30 now. So this is going to be 1 second of footage. So what I want to do is I want to create some movement in the sea. So first of all, I'm going to create that horizontal movement. So you recall that I set that with this offset X value here. So what I need to do is I need to hold down the mouse on this left mouse on here and now click animated. So at the moment I'm on frame 1, so there's a keyframe automatically set to frame 1. A keyframe is like it generates the movement in between the keyframes. They're called tweens. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the last frame by clicking this last frame button or end frame button. So now I'm on frame 30. You can see here the little slider down here is in frame 30, and we're going to click the plus button here to create a keyframe. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this to be 1. So the pace of the left to right that I showed you on the video earlier on is created by setting a rate of one horizontal movement for every 1 second of play. Now if I'm going in Z, I haven't played with that much because it's less likely you're going to need it, but it appeared to me that you need a factor of at least 10 times as much. So if I wanted the Z to look natural, I would do 10 times as much, so I'd do 10 as opposed to 1. Okay, so here I've set a keyframe at the end which has a value of 1. Now what I want to do is I want to create some up and down of the waves, because if I just set that to 1 and leave it, the waves are at a set height, but then they all just move like little soldiers. There's no ripples in them at all. They just all move horizontally. Now here's the trick that I discovered that I'm so happy with, and it's changing the gain. So what we're going to do for the gain, I found a nice gentle ripple value is 1 ripple every 15 frames or every half a second. So for this I'm going to go to 15. So I clicked in the frame number, go to 15, and now I'm going to turn the gain on as animated as well. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to decrease that value. So remember the gain is like the contrast. I'm going to decrease that value down to 0.2. You can play with that value, see what you like. But see, that goes more towards shades of grey, so there's less contrast. And again, I'm going to set that to be a keyframe. Then I'm going to go to the very last frame by going to end frame here. And I'm going to return that to 0.5. So basically what it's doing here is it's doing the ripple up and down. There's more contrast and less contrast, which creates the impression of waves growing and decreasing. And that's 2 every 1 second. And I'm also doing this horizontal movement of a rate of 1 every 1 second, and I think, I'm just going to guess, 1 certainly doesn't take you from one side of a screen to the other. I'm going to guess that it's something like 20 to go from here all the way to here. So you know, if you're trying to stop it with mine, as you can see, I'll just play it now. You can see it's quite a short loop. Even on 5 seconds, you can see the loop value there. So you know, it all depends. But just so long as you make that 1 for every second, then that will look okay. And again, with this offset, the less you make that, or the wider time interval, the slower the waves will be moving left to right. So if I wanted them to move half as slow, I'd do 0.5, or I'd increase the time to 2 seconds instead of 1. And the same with the gain. You know, I can increase or decrease according to the rate that I want them to ripple. So if I wanted fast water, I might do keyframes every 10 frames. If I want much slower ripples, I might do them every 30 frames, and that's up to you. So now let me show you how that looks in the animation window. Let me just open up the animation here. Hopefully that's not going to dock. So now this shows you animation for 1 second, 30 frames of animation. And you can see here, the only thing that being animated is a scene. You need to be really careful with the lights that you don't start moving them around in a frame other than the first frame. Anything I do in frame 1, let me just shut that a second. Anything I do in the first frame will affect all subsequent frames unless I add another keyframe to that element. And by that I mean, oops, where's that gone? By that I mean I can add keyframes to the lights independently of the other elements. And if I open up this C here, you'll see I've got the position, the scale, and then I've got these ground plane controls here as well. Unfortunately, they're not defined here as what they actually represent, which is annoying. It's just element 11 in the FBM fractal node, which is not very helpful. If that should really tell you what that is, gain or X and Y or something like that, but it's lazy, it's poorly thought out. But as you can see here, I've got it actually says I've got 2 keyframes, one in the X movement, but in actual fact it doesn't. But I could just go in there and delete that if I wanted to, just to be sure. So that will now create that animation that I showed you. And the really beautiful thing that I love about this way of creating waves is it doesn't matter how big your plane is, it reacts to the light. I could times this ground plane 10 times as big in the scale, and then obviously I may have to increase the number of subdivisions, which would definitely slow things down. But I can increase the size of the waves. I can change the X and Z scale, so I could make these giant momentous waves, or I can make them little tiny ripples. They can be ripples in a pond, they can be giant waves in an ocean. I've not found a way to make them break yet, but I am looking at possibly the wave modifier to do that, or even possibly the wind force modifier. I haven't really played with that, but I think that you'll agree that the end results of this really are worth the effort. So thank you very much for staying with me, guys, and I hope you find this useful.